In this lesson, we'll talk about variables, which are a very important part of VBA programming. A variable is just a placeholder for a piece of data in our program. Now, what do I mean by a piece of data? Well, data can mean anything from a number to a piece of text or a string to a complete VBA object like a range or a workbook or a worksheet. A variable is just a name that we choose as a developer that points to a specific object in our program, so we don't have to reference that object over and over and over again. So if you think back a while ago when we talked about fully qualified references, for example, when we used application and then workbooks and worksheets to reference a specific range object, that process of writing out that reference can take a while to write out. It's much easier to just write it out once and assign that final object reference to a variable, which again is just a placeholder name, and then reference that variable instead of writing out the entire object reference again. So variables are just simple ways that we can refer to something in our program without having to remember exactly what a specific value is or a specific object is. So let me go ahead and create a sample variable here for you. There's actually two parts to a variable. The first is the declaration, and the second is the assignment of a specific value. So the declaration, which is the first step, is the part where we tell VBA that we want to allocate a piece of computer memory for a variable. We're going to say, we're going to define a name here, a specific variable, which is just a name, and we also have to tell VBA the kind of data that it's going to hold, so that when we assign a value to it, VBA is prepared to store or reference that specific kind of data. So let me go ahead and create a brand new procedure here. I'm going to call it my first variable. And as soon as I add the parentheses and press enter, VBA will complete the end sub. So what I'm going to do here is write out a single variable declaration because it's a lot to take in at first. So I'm going to write it out completely and then go through it step by step. So here we go. Dim age as integer. As soon as I do a line break, perfect, there it is. The first part here is the dim keyword, which is actually part of VBA. It's a keyword within the language. Dim is short for dimension, and that's an old school computer science term for variable. So dim always has to be written before we write out any of our variables. So if we had more than one variable, we always place the dim keyword before the actual name. So immediately after the dim keyword, we write the name of the variable. This is our own decision. This is up to the developer. And ideally, the name should describe what the variable is going to hold. So in this case, I want a variable that's going to store my age. Let's say I don't want to remember it. I just want to store it in a variable once so that I can always reference age later in the program and know that it's always going to give me the actual numeric value of my age. So age is up to me to decide. In terms of the variable name, I've chosen age. That's the second thing I put in this sequence of 4 items. Immediately after the variable name, I put the keyword as. That also is part of VBA, and that also must always be included. And finally, at the very end, that's where we declare the variable type. This means the type of data that is being stored. We have, as I mentioned, many different types of data. We have integers, we have strings, we have complete VBA objects. We have to tell VBA, in order for it to allocate memory, exactly what we plan to store in this variable. In this case, age is going to be an integer. As a basic mathematic review, an integer is just a number without a floating point component, so a number without a decimal, a whole number like 5 or 10 or 15. Earlier on, when we were looking at some of the configuration settings in the Visual Basic Editor, we enabled an option that mandates that option explicit appears at the very top of each of our modules. This option explicit setting mandates that every variable be declared before we actually assign it a value. And when we say variable declaration, that's this part. We are telling the program as a statement of fact that we are going to have some kind of variable called age in this procedure, and that we expect age to be of an integer type, a whole number. But we haven't actually assigned it a value yet. We don't know what age is equal to. We just tell VBA to spare some memory for it. Now, there are a couple restrictions that VBA places on our variable names that I want you to be aware of. The first is that variable names cannot be greater than 255 characters. You're generally not going to run into this problem with your variable names, but I did want you to be aware of it. Variable names, exactly like procedure names, cannot contain spaces. So if you have multiple words, you can stick with the upper camel case syntax, which means the first letter of every word can be capitalized, and you can use that to sort of mark where a new word begins. But you cannot have actual spaces in your variable names. Variable names also cannot contain mathematical symbols like plus or minus. They cannot contain any kind of punctuation characters like the question mark or the exclamation point. They cannot contain special characters like the hashtag. And they cannot be reserved VBA keywords like sub or end or option or explicit or worksheet. So don't create a variable called worksheet. The variable actually has to be some kind of name that isn't part of the VBA language. The variable must also be unique in the procedure that defines it, which means we can't declare another variable called age in the exact same myFirstVariable procedure. So that's going to trigger an error in VBA. However, we can have the same variable names across different procedures. So if I had another procedure below my second variable and I declared a variable called age in there, that's totally valid. And age in my second procedure can be a totally different data type. The reason we can do this across different procedures is because the variable has this concept of scope. And scope refers to the limit or the reach or the boundary in which a variable exists. And a variable only exists as long as the procedure is running. So every time my first variable is executed, it's going to create a variable called age that's going to be an integer. But as soon as that procedure is done, that variable is tossed out of memory. It doesn't exist any longer. So whenever we run a second procedure that also has a variable called age, that second variable is simply going to be created from scratch. And that process continues over and over and over again. Finally, we cannot start a variable name with a number or an underscore. The variable name can contain a number or an underscore, but it cannot start with it. So the general best practice to follow is to start your variables with a letter and just make it as descriptive as possible. It should describe the actual value that it's holding. So age is a pretty good variable name. You don't want something like num or num1. You don't just want to say it's a number. You want to describe what it actually is, what it actually represents. So now that we've declared the age variable as a type of integer, we can actually go ahead and assign it a value. The way we do that is on the line below, we write the name of the variable. This is age, this is our own custom name. We give it an equal sign, much like if we were assigning a value to a property of an object, just an equal sign. And then on the right side, we write the actual value that we want to assign to this variable. So let's make the age variable equal to 26. So what does this mean? Well, age is now a placeholder, and it's a placeholder for a number of 26. That means that I can reference the variable age anywhere in this procedure's code, and it will give me the value 26. It's a representative of that value. It's a placeholder over it. So for example, if I wanted to debug print, rather than writing 26, I can simply write age. And whenever VBA evaluates this, it's not going to print the literal string age. Rather, it's going to say, hey, you have a variable here. What is that equal to? Oh, right here it's defined to be 26. So I know that it's a reference to that number. So this is going to evaluate to 26. So when I execute this procedure, 26 is going to print in my immediate window. Remember that age is a variable that represents a number, but we're not limited to simply outputting that variable. We can do any kind of operations that we would do with a plain number. So for example, if I want to message box and I want to see what my age will be in 4 years, what I can do is age plus 4. The reason I can do this is because age is just a name for a number. It represents, it's a placeholder for the value that I assign up here. So when VBA is evaluating this, it's going to substitute age for the value it's assigned up here, 26. It's going to add 4 to get 30, and once it evaluates to 30, that's what message box is going to output for us. So when I execute this, a message box with 30 is going to appear in the middle right here. One last detail. VBA is not case sensitive, which means a variable with a capital A and a variable with a lowercase a are the exact same thing. VBA will generally try to correct you whenever you use the wrong case. So for example, if I try doing something like this, if I try typing age with a lowercase a, you can see it's automatically going to boost it back up to an uppercase A because it identifies that that variable exists. But VBA is not case sensitive. So in case of any kind of error, do not declare variables with the same name but different casing. VBA will try to correct for it, but you should avoid it as a general practice. If you want another variable, find a completely different name to give it. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. Variables are just placeholders or names that we assign to pieces of data in our code. Right now, I'm sure you're not seeing the big benefit of this, but rest assured variables are really helpful when we get to the nitty-gritty of actually accessing values on our spreadsheet, manipulating them, overwriting them. Variables help simplify the process of referencing complex objects. That's all there is to cover here, and throughout this entire section, we're going to be diving a lot into variables and the various data types that we can use in our code. It's an important foundation to lay before we start diving into the actual parts of programming in VBA itself.